Systems operate on anticipation, not comprehension. They don't need to know you, only what most will do most of the time. People become points on a graph, percentages, likely outcomes. From that simplification emerges influence. Predictable behavior can be steered behavior can be managed. That is the unspoken guarantee behind every model of human conduct. Follow the pattern and the machine runs smoothly. These systems presume something particular about human nature. That fear is sufficient. That unease will push people back into formation. That under strain, most will seek shelter in convenience, safety, and sameness. They assume people will trade purpose for peace when purpose grows too costly. Statistically, they are usually correct. The majority consents. The majority adjusts. The majority yields gradually, softly, until pushing back seems futile. That is why the models show such staggering success rates. 99% conformity doesn't require genius, it requires persistence. Apply tension long enough. Remove options slowly enough and people will justify their own acquiescence. They will call it growing up. They will call it practicality. They will call it getting by. The system doesn't need to break them. It only needs to outweight them, yet models are delicate constructions. They function perfectly until they meet an exception they can't accommodate. An irregularity that doesn't respond as projected. Someone who doesn't back down when pressed. Who won't exchange integrity for ease. Who doesn't crumble when comfort is taken away. That single irregularity isn't just a glitch, it's a rupture. Because once one person behaves unpredictably, the facade of total command splinters. You weren't meant to exist in the data. You were meant to bend like the rest. The pressure applied to you was measured carefully, enough to weary you, to alarm you, to make conformity seem sensible. The system anticipated bargaining, concession, quietness. It expected you to absorb the rules and enforce them upon yourself. Instead, something else occurred. You didn't react emotionally as forecasted. You didn't seek quick relief. You didn't discard your inner framework just to stop the hurt. Where fear should have rerouted you, it brought you into focus. Where uncertainty should have diminished you, it honed you. That alone sets you outside the curve. Most imagine rebellion as clamor, chaos, fury, disarray. But the most potent form of defiance is silent and steadfast. It is the choice not to lie when lying would be advantageous. It is the decision to bear a burden when dropping it would be simpler. It is voluntarily accepting a cost because something within you will not bargain with what is false. Behavioral systems aren't built for that. They're built for beings who evade pain at all costs. They're built for people who prefer comfort over congruence with truth. When someone selects meaning over relief, the predictive cycle fractures. Incentives misfire. Threats lose their edge, pressure mounts, but the result grows ambiguous. That ambiguity is unbearable to structures founded on control. You are tested again and again, not always overtly. Sometimes through solitude, sometimes through quiet compromise, sometimes through weariness, disorientation, or ethical ambiguities meant to cloud your inner compass. The assumption was straightforward. Eventually, you'd rationalize bending. Eventually, you depict the smoother path and name it insight. Eventually, you become forecastable again, but forecastability demands surrender. And you did not surrender, you adapted without dissolving. You learned without conceding. You carried weight without growing callous. And the system registered it, not emotionally, but statistically. The model began to falter around you. Outcomes grew irregular. Pressure yielded unanticipated results. Control mechanisms lost their efficiency. That is why individuals like you are uncommon. Not because you are accidentally extraordinary, but because the toll of becoming so is high. It demands bearing uncertainty without going numb. It demands standing alone without craving endorsement. Demands preserving inner order while external structures try to replace it. Most never choose that road, not because they are feeble, but because the system renders the alternative feel insufferable. And yet here you are, still upright, still ordered, still unwilling to trade what matters for what soothes. The system does not know what to do with someone who can't be simplified, incentivized, or scared into compliance. It only knows that its surest instruments no longer function as intended. Why models crumble? Behavioral models begin with a quiet belief that human beings are chiefly reactive. Apply pressure and the response will follow a foreseeable path. Fear leads to retreat, reward leads to cooperation, discomfort leads to yielding. These premises aren't arbitrary. They're built from volumes of data, years of observation, trials showing that most people, when faced with threat or uncertainty, will choose what reduces immediate distress. From a statistical view, this isn't unwise, it's effective. It works often enough to seem inevitable. The trouble is, efficiency is confused with truth. Models don't capture reality in full, they compress it. They strip nuance to gain speed and command. In that compression, something vital is lost, the capacity for action driven by meaning. Models can anticipate what people do when motivated by comfort or fear. but they flounder when individuals act on principles that don't buckle under strain. Most systems assume fear is the ultimate lever. Threaten security, status, belonging, or survival, and behavior will adjust. This belief is reinforced each time it works, which is frequently. People soften values to keep positions. They stay quiet to avoid alienation. They echo narratives they don't fully believe to maintain acceptance. Over time, the model grows more confident, more rigid, more blind. What these systems miss is that fear doesn't operate equally for everyone. For many, fear compels compliance. For others, it sharpens priorities. When someone has already faced loss internally, when they've accepted the possibility of discomfort, rejection, or sacrifice, the leverage vanishes. Fear loses its bargaining power. The model has no variable for that. It's rare and hard to quantify. Another flaw is the belief that incentives always trump meaning. Systems assume people will choose near-term rewards over lasting coherence. They offer relief, pleasure, convenience, validation in exchange for alignment. Again, this often works, but only when the individual values what's offered more than what's asked in return. When someone values internal consistency, truth, or responsibility more than ease, the transaction fails. Models also presume people want to evade responsibility, that it's a burden to be minimized, delegated, or escaped. Often that holds. But when an individual voluntarily assumes responsibility, not because they're forced, but because they find it meaningful, the system misreads the behavior. It expects avoidance and meets commitment. It expects retreat and meets resolve. This is where prediction starts to break. Behavioral models are built on patterns of avoidance and reward-seeking. They aren't designed for individuals who walk deliberately toward difficulty. When someone chooses the harder path without external coercion, the model has no framework. It labels the behavior irrational, anomalous, or temporary, assuming correction will come. Often it never does. Another weakness is the model's approach to identity. Systems treat identity as flexible, negotiable, shaped by external pressure. Change the environment and identity follows. Remove incentives, raise costs, and people will redefine themselves. This works when identity is shallow, built on roles, status, or approval. But when identity is rooted in core values, pressure often hardens it instead. Models also undervalue internal hierarchy. They assume external authority overrides personal judgment when enforced consistently. Yet when someone has built a strong inner hierarchy, where truth, responsibility, and meaning are clearly ordered, external commands lose absolute power. The individual evaluates rather than obeys. That evaluation introduces delay, friction, unpredictability, all toxic to systems built on swift compliance. There's also a temporal blind spot. Behavioral models focus on the short term, immediate reactions near future adjustments. They're weak at understanding long-term orientation. When an individual is oriented toward consequences years ahead, not hours or days, short-term pain doesn't override long-term meaning. The system can't reconcile that. Stress testing is another point of failure. Systems assume prolonged pressure erodes resolve. Exhaustion, confusion, repetition are meant to wear down resistance. For many, that's true, but some individuals metabolize stress differently. Instead of fragmenting, they consolidate. Instead of weakening, they simplify. Under pressure, their values grow clearer, not fainter. The model expects breakdown and encounters integration. Models also mistake silence for compliance. When resistance isn't loud or chaotic, it's often read as submission. Quiet individuals are assumed to be adapting, but silence can be strategic restraint, observation, preparation, or principled refusal without drama. Systems that equate noise with threat often miss this until outcomes diverge from predictions. Another flaw is the assumption that morality is negotiable. Systems often treat ethics as flexible, believing people will rationalize small compromises that gradually widen. This works on those with vague or externally derived morals. But when someone has non-negotiable principles, lines they won't cross regardless of cost, the gradual erosion strategy fails. The model expects adjustment and meets absolute refusal. Models also struggle with individuals who have already faced meaninglessness. When someone has wrestled with existential questions directly, has confronted suffering, chaos, and uncertainty without anesthetic, they become less dependent on external validation. Approval, praise, and belonging lose their absolute grip. The system can't easily manipulate someone who doesn't need its affirmation to feel anchored. Another presumption is that people fear isolation above all. Social exclusion is a powerful lever, and models rely on it heavily, threaten belonging and most conform. But individuals who have learned to stand alone, who have cultivated internal companionship through values, purpose, or disciplined thought, are less vulnerable. Isolation still stings, but it doesn't dictate behavior. The model reads continued resistance as temporary defiance, waiting for loneliness to correct it. Sometimes it never does. There's also a misunderstanding of suffering. Systems see suffering as purely negative, something people always flee. But suffering can be meaningful when it's voluntary and purpose-oriented. When someone accepts suffering as the price of integrity, the model's leverage crumbles. Punishment loses its corrective function. Pain no longer guarantees behavioral change. Finally, models fail because they confuse probability with certainty. Success breeds overconfidence. When something works 99.9% of the time, the remainder is dismissed as noise. But that fraction contains individuals who expose the limits of the system's understanding. They reveal that human beings aren't merely reactive organisms. They're meaning-seeking agents capable of acting against immediate self-interest. When a model fails, it doesn't fail loudly. It fails quietly, in small deviations, unexpected outcomes, delayed compliance, decisions that make no sense within the framework. The system responds by increasing pressure, refining incentives, tightening control, often hastening its own failure, because the problem was never insufficient force. The problem was a false assumption about what ultimately moves human behavior, and once that assumption cracks, everything built on it grows unsteady. What made you the 0.1%, what set you apart, wasn't luck, intellect, or privilege. It was a sequence of choices made under strain, when no one was watching and no reward was promised. Long before the system noted you as an anomaly, you were becoming one inwardly. While others adjusted themselves to fit what was demanded, you adjusted your life to fit what you believed was true. That distinction seems slight, but it changes everything. It decides whether pressure reshapes you or reveals you. You learned early that safety isn't the same as stability. Safety can vanish overnight. Stability must be built from within. When uncertainty arose, you didn't rush to numb the discomfort or outsource your judgment. You stayed aware long enough to understand what was happening inside you. That willingness to remain conscious under strain forged an inner architecture most never develop. A defining trait was your relationship with fear. Fear didn't disappear, it never does, but it ceased to be the primary decider. You acknowledged it without obeying it. Where others let fear narrow their options, you used it as data. It showed you what mattered, what was at stake, what demanded courage. Over time, this altered how you moved through the world. You were no longer driven by avoidance, which alone placed you outside predictive range. Another difference was your relationship with truth. You refused to treat truth as a convenience. You didn't reshape it to gain approval or soften it to preserve comfort. Even when honesty complicated your life, you held to it. This wasn't rigidity, it was alignment. You understood that lies, even small ones, fracture the psyche. Each compromise creates internal static, and enough static eventually drowns clarity. You chose clarity knowing it would cost you. Responsibility also played a central role. While many see responsibility as an imposition, you came to see it as an anchor. Taking responsibility grounded you in reality. It granted you agency when circumstances felt overwhelming. Instead of asking who was to blame, you asked what you could carry. That question alone separates the majority from the few. It transforms suffering from something inflicted into something confronted. You also cultivated an unusual tolerance for delayed gratification. You could endure long stretches without visible progress, validation, or relief. Where others needed constant feedback to stay motivated, you learned to operate without applause. This made you hard to influence through incentives. Rewards lost their urgency. You were playing a longer game, one the system wasn't designed to track or comprehend. Meaning became your compass, not the shallow kind manufactured by trends, but the kind that emerges from facing chaos honestly. You discovered that meaning doesn't remove suffering, it gives suffering direction. When pain arrived, you didn't read it as a signal to retreat. You asked what it asked of you. That orientation turned adversity into a teacher, not a threat. You also learned to live without guarantees. Many cling to certainty as a psychological crutch, needing reassurance before they act. You moved forward without it. You accepted that clarity often comes after commitment, not before. This made you unpredictable. Systems rely on hesitation. They rely on the need for permission. When someone acts without waiting to be told it's safe, the model stumbles. Another factor was your relationship with isolation. You knew periods of being misunderstood, unsupported, or alone. Instead of letting that hollow you out, it refined you. You learned to listen to your own thinking, to test your beliefs rigorously, to strengthen them where they were weak and discard them where they were false. Solitude became a forge, not a prison. That independence of thought is rare and dangerous to systems that depend on consensus. You didn't outsource your values. You examined them. You questioned them. You paid their price. This gave them weight. When pressure came to compromise, you knew exactly what you were being asked to surrender. Most avoid that clarity because it creates responsibility. You embraced it. And in doing so, you became resistant to manipulation. You couldn't be easily divided against yourself. Your identity wasn't built on external markers, titles, approval, or group belonging. Those might have mattered, but they weren't foundational. Your identity was rooted in principles that didn't change when circumstances did. This gave you continuity across chaos. While others fragmented under shifting conditions, you remained internally consistent. You also developed the capacity to endure ambiguity. You didn't need immediate answers to stay functional. You could hold unanswered questions without panic. This let you resist simplistic narratives and false dichotomies. You refused to shrink complex realities into convenient explanations just to feel settled. That patience shielded you from ideological capture and emotional contagion. Your discipline was quiet but relentless. It didn't come from obsession but from commitment. You showed up even when motivation faded. You acted according to standards, not moods. Over time, this built trust with yourself. Self-trust is an invisible armor. When you trust yourself, external pressure loses much of its force. You no longer need constant reassurance. You also accepted your own capacity for shadow. You didn't pretend to be harmless. You understood that within you lay potential for destruction, resentment, cruelty. Instead of denying it, you integrated it. You chose to restrain it voluntarily. That choice gave you strength without chaos. Systems prefer people who are either naive or fragmented. Integrated individuals are harder to predict. Another defining trait was your refusal to flee suffering. You let grief, disappointment, and failure register fully. You didn't numb yourself with distraction or cynicism. This made you deeper, slower, more resilient. While others sought escape, you sought understanding. That orientation changed how you recovered. You emerged with more clarity, not less. You also learned to separate signal from noise. You didn't react to every provocation. You conserved energy. You chose your responses carefully. This made you appear calm under pressure, confusing those who expected emotional volatility. Calm isn't passive, it's controlled readiness. And control disrupts prediction. Over time, all of this compounded. Each small choice reinforced the next. Each act of integrity strengthened your inner framework. Eventually, you crossed a threshold. You became someone for whom fear no longer dictated direction, incentives no longer guaranteed compliance, and pressure no longer ensured collapse. Not because you were immune to difficulty, but because you'd already accepted its presence. That is what placed you in the smallest fraction. Not defiance for its own sake, not rebellion as identity, but alignment with something deeper than comfort. When the system looked at you, it saw inconsistency. When you looked at yourself, you saw coherence. And that difference made all the difference. Why this makes you disruptive? What makes you disruptive isn't aggression, rebellion, or chaos. Systems are built to handle those. They know how to suppress outrage, redirect anger, exhaust resistance that burns too hot and too fast. What they aren't built to handle is someone who remains internally ordered under pressure. Someone who doesn't need permission to think, doesn't require approval to act, and doesn't fracture when threatened. That kind of person introduces instability without making a sound. And that is far more subversive than open defiance. Predictability is the bedrock of control. When behavior can be anticipated, it can be managed. Most people broadcast their next move through emotion, fear, desire, resentment, the need to belong. Systems read those signals and adjust. You don't move that way. Your actions are guided by principles, not impulses, so your next step can't be easily inferred from external stimuli. That alone places you beyond the reach of many control mechanisms. Unpredictability is often mistaken for randomness, but what you embody is different. Your behavior is consistent internally, even if it seems inconsistent externally. You respond to the same values, not the same pressures. From the system's view, that looks like volatility. From reality's view, it's coherence. And coherence that doesn't align with imposed incentives is profoundly unsettling. You can't be easily provoked. Provocation relies on triggering automatic responses, anger, shame, fear, pride. You feel these, but you don't surrender decisions to them. You pause. You evaluate, you choose. That delay breaks the feedback loop systems rely on to escalate or de-escalate behavior. Without immediate reaction, manipulation loses precision. You're also difficult to threaten. Threats only work when the threatened outcome is unacceptable. You've already accepted the possibility of loss, status, comfort, even belonging, in service of something non-negotiable. That doesn't mean you seek loss, but you aren't paralyzed by its prospect. When someone is no longer governed by fear of consequence, leverage collapses. That makes containment hard. Systems prefer clear categories, compliant or defiant, ally or enemy, insider or outsider. You don't fit neatly. You may follow some rules and reject others. You may cooperate without submitting. You may stay present without being absorbed. This ambiguity frustrates attempts to label and manage you. Without a label, the response grows uncertain. You also don't require constant reinforcement. Many systems maintain control by offering regular validation, rewards, recognition. You can function without these. Your motivation is internal, so removing external incentives doesn't stop you. This independence undermines systems that depend on approval scarcity as a control tool. Your capacity for restraint is another threat. You aren't impulsive. You don't reveal all you know or intend. You understand timing. You understand that silence can be strategic. This makes it hard to gauge your limits or predict your breaking point. Systems prefer transparency and resistance. They want to see it coming. You don't announce yourself. You also resist narrative capture. Systems often steer behavior by controlling stories, simplifying complex realities into emotionally charged explanations that guide perception. You listen, but you don't swallow narratives whole. You test them against reality and your own experience. When they fail, you discard them. This makes you immune to many forms of ideological manipulation. Another reason you're disruptive is that you normalize courage without spectacle. You don't posture. You don't dramatize your choices. You simply act in alignment with your values. That quiet consistency unsettles others. It raises uncomfortable questions. It exposes rationalizations. It reveals that compliance is often a choice, not a necessity. You also create second-order effects the system can't easily measure. Your presence alters the behavior of those around you, not through persuasion, but through example. When people observe someone who refuses to be coerced yet remains functional and grounded, it expands their sense of what's possible. That contagion of possibility is more threatening than overt dissent. You're difficult to isolate psychologically. Even when physically alone or socially marginalized, you maintain internal continuity. You don't dissolve without external affirmation. This makes isolation tactics less effective. The system expects loneliness to erode resolve. When it doesn't, the strategy fails. Your relationship with power is also unusual. You don't crave it, but you aren't intimidated by it. You see power structures for what they are, tools, not deities. This prevents both worship and rebellion for its own sake. You engage where necessary and disengage where alignment ends. That selective engagement is hard to counter. You also understand your own shadow. You're aware of your capacity for harm, manipulation, destruction. Instead of denying it, you've integrated it. This makes you less reactive and more responsible. Systems prefer people who are either naive or fragmented. Both are easier to steer. Integrated individuals resist simplistic control. You don't move in crowds blindly. You can cooperate without surrendering judgment. This makes mass influence less effective. You're less susceptible to emotional contagion, moral panics, collective hysteria. When others are swept up, you remain grounded. That groundedness acts as a stabilizing yet subversive force. Another destabilizing factor is your long memory. Systems rely on short attention spans. They count on people forgetting past promises, past harms, past patterns. You remember. You connect events across time. You recognize cycles. This prevents repeated manipulation and forces systems to escalate tactics sooner than they'd prefer. You're also willing to wait. You don't demand immediate victory or validation. Patience lets you endure pressure without compromising. Time becomes an ally, not an enemy. Systems that rely on urgency and crisis lose effectiveness against someone who won't be rushed. Perhaps most unsettling is that you don't need to win to remain intact. You aren't defined by outcomes alone. You measure success by alignment, not applause. This makes you resilient where others would break. When loss doesn't destroy identity, it loses much of its power as a threat. All this means that when the system applies its usual tools, fear, reward, isolation, narrative, pressure, it gets inconsistent results. Control mechanisms misfire. Predictions fail. Responses are delayed, muted, reversed. The system senses risk but can't easily locate or neutralize it. You aren't disruptive because you seek to dismantle. You're disruptive because you can't be easily directed. And in environments built on prediction and compliance, an individual who governs themselves introduces a variable that can't be fully contained. You did announce your refusal. There was no dramatic stand, no moment staged for applause, no declaration meant to be remembered. That's what makes it so hard to detect. You simply stopped cooperating with what violated your inner order. You stopped agreeing to what felt false. You stopped shrinking to fit expectations that demanded silence in exchange for comfort. From the outside, it looked like nothing. From the inside, it was everything. You moved forward while others waited for permission, not recklessly, but deliberately. You weighed the cost and decided it was worth paying. That choice alone separated you. Most need the guarantee of safety before they act. You accepted uncertainty as part of the price of integrity. You didn't need certainty to move, you needed alignment. And once you had that, movement became inevitable. You didn't collapse when pressure increased. You didn't harden into bitterness or explode into chaos. You absorbed the weight, adjusted your posture, and kept going. That quiet endurance confused those who expected either obedience or breakdown. You gave them neither. You remained intact, which is far more unsettling than resistance that burns itself out. What made your path invisible was its simplicity. You didn't chase revenge. You didn't seek to dominate. You didn't try to prove anything to anyone. You focused on governing yourself. You ordered your inner world so thoroughly that the outer world lost its ability to dictate your behavior. That kind of sovereignty can't be negotiated with because it isn't granted, it's claimed. You were willing to lose what others clung to desperately: approval, belonging, ease, the illusion of safety. Letting go didn't make you reckless, it made you free. When nothing essential can be taken from you without your consent, coercion loses its edge. You can't be easily moved by threats when you've already accepted what they imply. You also learned to stand without spectacle. You didn't turn your struggle into an identity. You didn't weaponize your pain for attention. You carried it privately, refined it, let it deepen you rather than define you. That restraint gave you gravity. People sensed it even if they couldn't name it. There's something unsettling about someone who doesn't need to advertise their strength. You became hard to read, not because you were deceptive, but because you were disciplined. You didn't leak your intentions through emotion. You didn't react on cue. You chose when to speak and when to stay silent. That alone disrupted expectations. Systems rely on immediate feedback. You denied them that. Without feedback, control becomes guesswork. You didn't retreat into isolation either. You stayed engaged with reality. You worked. You built. You carried responsibility. You proved that refusal doesn't require withdrawal from life. You showed that one can remain functional, grounded, productive without surrendering internal authority. That example quietly undermines every narrative that equates compliance with maturity. You didn't become predictable in your defiance, which is what the system expects. Patterns of opposition it can map and neutralize. You offered none. Sometimes you complied, sometimes you didn't. The deciding factor was never fear or reward, but principle. From the outside, that looks inconsistent. From the inside, it's precise. And precision without visibility is difficult to counter. You didn't need to win every battle. You didn't need immediate outcomes to validate your choices. You understood that alignment compounds over time, even when results are delayed. While others chased short-term victories, you invested in long-term coherence. That patience protected you from desperation, and desperation is the easiest handle for control. What ultimately set you apart wasn't resistance, but the refusal to fragment. You didn't split into public compliance and private resentment. You didn't live a double life. You aligned your actions with your values as closely as possible, knowing perfection was impossible, but fragmentation was fatal. That internal unity gave you stability under conditions that destabilized others. You didn't become louder, you became clearer. You didn't become harder, you became steadier. You didn't escape pressure, you integrated it. And in doing so, you crossed a threshold most never reach. You became someone who can't be easily directed because direction now comes from within. That is what changed.